Hey guys. Okay, so we'll just wait a couple seconds for the last few people to um, trickle in. And yeah, I guess while we wait, I'll talk about Fiveable. So, okay, Fiveable is actually really cool because what it aims to do is make sure that education is like way more accessible for people, like overall, because I know that in high school, a lot of us take APs. Hey, Brandon. So Fiveable tries to make sure that like everyone has access to like the resources they need to get a 5 on their exam. So the way that I first learned about Fiveable was through one of my friends. Actually, it was Brandon, who's like currently watching the stream, and he told me about it like very recently. And so I thought it was super cool because like as someone who's like sometimes like your teachers might not teach the way you think is like the best way for you personally. Like Fiveable has ways that you can follow along and they'll do like live essay writing. So like that's super cool to me. And so that's why I like Fiveable. Okay, so today's cast is going to be about civics, and specifically we're going to be talking about gerrymandering. And if you don't know what it is, that's completely fine because like before high school, neither did I. So like hopefully we can all figure it out together, right? So before we get started, everyone follow Fiveable on all of their social media. It's at Think Fiveable. They'll let you know when people are going to be like live streaming and stuff, and you will also get to access a bunch of very funny AP memes. So priorities, you know. So I'll introduce myself really quickly. My name is Fatma. I am going to be a senior this year, and I went to DC this summer. So this is very on brand for what we're going to be talking about in terms of like civics issues. So yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so what is gerrymandering? It's the cold definition is drawing boundaries of electoral districts in a way that gives one party an unfair advantage over its rivals. So pretty much it means that you want to advantage one political party over another. And the reason why that like actually makes sense is because we have electoral districts, which pretty much means like in each state, there's going to be like lines drawn. So if you live in one specific area, you are going to vote for a representative. And even if you live like a street away from one of your friends, they might not be voting in that same electoral race because they might be in a different district. So that's pretty much why gerrymandering matters. And so, what is gerrymandering? Like, how did we get here? Like, the historical background is that there was this man, and he like participated in the constitutional conventions too, and he became the governor of Massachusetts, and his name was Elbridge Gerry. That's why we have gerrymandering. And so he was the member of the Democratic Republican Party, and so because he was trying to weaken the Federalist Party, he like drew this like electoral district that looked like a salamander. And so like the political cartoon that's like right next to it actually was like based on that event because they said that like Gary is trying to draw a district that looks like a salamander. So for some reason they gave it wings and the term gerrymandering was born because it was a combination between Governor Elbridge's last name Gerry or Gary and salamander. Gerrymander. Okay, yeah, that's pretty much how that came to be about. But there's some like key things we need to understand before we get into like the like the weeds. So one of those things is the census. So the way that gerrymandering works and redistricting works is through the census. So pretty much, if you don't know what the census is, every 10 years, the federal government will do a count of the American population. So they'll like go around and like knock on doors and be like, how many people live here? And they'll like pretty much just like ask your ethnicity and stuff like that. But the reason why they do that is because electoral college votes and like the amount of congressional representatives you get at the federal level is based off of this. So that's why the census is super important. And if you like, if any of you guys like remember a few like weeks or months ago, there was a huge Supreme Court case talking about how whether or not there could be an immigration question asking about people's like legal status on the census. And so what people were worried about was that some people would be too scared to answer the census because they would be worried about like legal status and like their friends' legal status and family's legal status. So it would lead in the end to an unfair amount of representation. And because a lot of federal funds are also based off of this, a lot of people were worried. But moving on, what we're talking about right now is redistricting. So redistricting is based on the census because the state legislature has to make sure that there's like about an equal amount of people in each district. They look at the census to get that information. That's why it's so important. So the way that gerrymandering like works is through two big ways. There's cracking, which is you break up a population and you put it in more than one district to like make sure it has less voting power overall. So if there's this one group that's very concentrated in one area, then you would like break it up with a bunch of other like political parties where there's more of the other political parties. So there's like less voting power for that specific group overall. So their power isn't concentrated in one place. But what packing does is pretty much the exact opposite. You put all of that like concentrated group in one district. So overall, at the end of the day, they don't win as many districts like in the state legislature. So they just win that one specific or like few specific gerrymandered areas. So this is like pretty much one of the very big graphics that comes with like having gerrymandering. So like when you look at this first one, it's showing you how many like people there are there, right? So there's 60% of these precincts are blue and 40% are red. So in an ideal world, you would want like 60% of all of the representatives to be like of the blue party and 40% of them to be of the red party, right? But when we look towards cracking, which is happening in the middle, there's 5 blue representatives, meaning that even though there's like people that associate with the red party there, they don't get any representation. So that's obviously not very fair, right? But you can also do another way, like I just talked about, like packing. Even though there's more people who associate with the blue party, they have less representation because their group got broken up and their voting power was diluted because they were also put in with like areas that had more red. So like in both worlds, like even though like one party does win, like it's not very fair representation for the people overall. So like that's what gerrymandering has the power to do to like a lot of different groups. So obviously there's like very important interests that like get to decide how gerrymandering will happen in our democracy, right? So there's this quote from Chief Justice John Roberts, and he called the social science that like identifies gerrymandering sociological gobbledygook, because it's like a lot of math involved. And so what he was trying to say was we should keep constitutional law based on like legal practices as opposed to like mathematical numbers and stuff like that. So we're going to like dive into like what the courts have said recently and before about gerrymandering. So first we can look at like the 3 main arguments that come with like making sure that everyone has equal representation in terms of like gerrymandering. So the first is the 14th Amendment. There was this case in 1962 called Baker v. Carr, and it pretty much established that each person should have one vote. So everyone's vote should be equal in every election, right? So this means that each district should have about an equal amount of population, right? Because if you think about it, if this didn't exist, you could technically have like districts with like 50 different people, and like that would just be one district. But you could also have a district with one person. So both districts would have equal power in the legislature, even though they wouldn't have equal population. So that's one reason why that case was very important. So another thing was the Voting Rights Act. And so Congress passed this in 1965, and it said that you can't dilute minority votes by like breaking them up. So you have to keep interest groups together. So pretty much it said that like cracking isn't allowed. So then lastly, we have the First Amendment. And so this is something that's like come up very recently, I would say, in like Supreme Court law, and like cases are pretty much making the argument saying that partisan gerrymandering attacks people for the political party that they associate with. So people are losing their First Amendment right to associate with whatever political ideology that they wish. So that's pretty much what the First Amendment says. So now that we understand that, we can look at like the major legal developments that have been happening. So Shelby County v. Holder happened a few years ago in 2013, actually. So what the Supreme Court did was it struck down Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, which we just talked about. So what Section 4B was pretty much like the mapping for what areas were considered to be discriminatory. And so the reason why that was important was because those specific jurisdictions or areas had to get like pre-clearance from the Department of Justice before they passed new like voting laws or did new redistricting, because they had like been discriminatory in the past. So the Supreme Court pretty much said that that map was old, and like now times have changed since like those decades ago, right? But what that means now is that Section 5, the part that says that federal pre-clearance is needed, doesn't really work because there's no map to like base it on. So that's like obviously kind of problematic because there's like nothing stopping these areas from discriminating against people. But technically Congress could make a new map if they wanted to, but that obviously has not been done to date. So it's the reason why we see a lot of voter suppression laws being passed in like different states. Yeah, because of the Shelby County v. Holder case. And so this was the impact of the case. Like when you look at the states that are dark red, they're the states that have passed restrictive voting laws since 2013, since like the Shelby case. And so like that includes states like Alaska, like Texas, home state, woohoo. But it also, like other states like California, haven't done that, obviously. So like, yeah, woo, Texas. So like, yeah, there's obviously like Shelby did have a big impact because it made sure that like a lot of areas that had been discriminatory in the past could now go back to being discriminatory because there's like no law stopping them from doing that. But there's like still more that's like happened since then, right? Like Rucho v. Common Cause. This was actually a very important case because it happened incredibly recently, like within the past year or two, I would say. The Supreme Court said that federal courts can't intervene when it comes to political gerrymandering. So they couldn't like strike maps down, even if like the maps were politically motivated, right? So it's that like the Supreme Court, because it was trying to be like completely uninvolved within politics, saying that the courts are above politics, diving into deciding whether or not a map was unfair or not for a specific political party would pretty much be like akin to making the maps political. So that's what the Supreme Court said it didn't want to do. So that was like a 5-4 ruling. So obviously 4 people disagree with that sentiment. But what it also did was it left the North Carolina map, which favors Republicans, and the Maryland map, which favors Democrats, alone. And that's important because what a lot of people felt was that like the Supreme Court could use this specific example because it both had Republicans and Democrats like having extreme gerrymandering. It could just say that it was undemocratic overall because it would be harder to say it was motivated by a political ideology if both Democrats and Republicans are like gerrymandering and being told that they can't do that. But at the end of the day, state courts can still intervene if they choose to do so, which they have. So like to understand how we got to all of these legal developments, like we have to look towards like the past. So let's do just that. First, we have a lot of competing interests because all of the laws that were passed, like the Voting Rights Act and like the First and 14th Amendments, like the way we want our elections to run is that we want them to be competitive, right? But at the same time, like we have laws saying that each district has to have a roughly equal population. But the Voting Rights Act also says that we have to keep interest groups together. And also, we want these districts to be compact. So there's a lot of different things that legislatures have to like take into account when they're like creating these district maps. So when we look at this example, it's the 4th district from Illinois, right? And so a lot of people think like this is super unfair because it pretty much looks like a horseshoe and it skips out on like all of the different people that live in like in between the gaps. But what is actually the exact opposite is the fact that it's actually keeping an interest group together. So this is a group that's like composed of a majority of like a Latinx community. So like we want to like keep that interest group together. So like that's what Illinois had to do in order to like make sure that the interest group wasn't split up. So sometimes redistricting can be a little bit difficult when you want to prevent gerrymandering because you have to make sure that these different groups don't get split up and lost in the shuffle. But when we look towards gerrymandering that's motivated by like a specific political ideology, we can look towards Project Redmap. So this was actually, I first learned about it from a podcast that a friend recommended to me. And so Project Redmap was the Redistricting Majority Project. And so it was started in 2010 by the Republican State Leadership Commission. So what they wanted to do was control redistricting efforts, because if you control redistricting efforts, you can pretty much decide who is going to be voting in which election, right? So you can decide pretty much an election because you know who lives there. Like we have these like voter rolls where people are registered, right? And that's like all public information. So what the RSLC did was they focused on swing states that were primarily already controlled by Democrats. So those were states like Ohio, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. And so they put little amounts of money into state legislative seats because not a lot of people tend to pay attention to them, right? And so that's incredibly critical because when you look towards the fact that if not a lot of people are paying attention to an election and you put in like $1,000 or $2,000, right? Like that could make the difference between someone being able to like run advertisements compared to their opponent who's running absolutely no advertisements and like just that person losing an election. So that actually had huge effects because in 2012, even though Democrats won a majority of the population of like the popular vote, Republicans won the House by 33 seats. They also gained around 700 seats at the state level and a bunch of governorships, right? So obviously Project Redmap worked very well. So the reason why they focused on the state legislature and governorships was because that would allow them to have full control of redistricting. Because what a lot of states do is even if a state legislature passes a district map, the governor can veto it. So that means it goes back, and so they can like keep doing that until the governor decides that it's fair. But if you control the legislature and the governorship, that's not possible to do because there's absolutely no dissenting voice in that process. So that's why they wanted to stop gerrymandering from being bipartisan, from redistricting from being bipartisan. And so what a lot of people say is that gerrymandering is super bipartisan. Both parties do it, like we talked about earlier, like the example of the Maryland case where Democrats were favored and the other case where Republicans were favored. That's where the idea that both parties gerrymander. But like obviously when we look at the Redmap case, like Republicans have been able to truly like mobilize and like use gerrymandering on like a very large scale. So the only difference between the parties gerrymandering is that Republicans have been way better at it and way more effective at it, I should say, because obviously it has created a lot of unfair representation in a lot of places, right? So the reason why they're able to do this is because like technology has become so advanced when it comes to gerrymandering. Like, it's literally insane how far we've come from just a couple of decades ago. So before 1990, gerrymandering technology was not advanced, and it was super expensive because it had these files called like tiger files, right? And so those were created by the US Census Bureau after they've done the census. And so that technology was super difficult to use because you needed a lot of user manuals and like lots of code, and it was super complicated, and it took way too much manpower than anyone was willing to like devote, right? And it cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to use because of it. So it wasn't like widely utilized. But then this company called like the Caliper Corporation made something called GIS, which stands for Geographic Information System. And so, like, side note, if anyone here has taken like freshman English, like Black archetype intelligence, but also evil, anyone? Okay. So pretty much what that technology did was it made maps. And so that might not sound like super complex or anything, but it was actually very important because like these files are what people started using to create like districting maps. And so, yeah, so like Corporation decided to like totally capitalize this. And so they made the technology super easy to use, and they made it way cheaper. And so like if you look in the corner, like this picture right here, it's an example of like that like technology of the software. So you could use it on desktops, and you didn't really need to learn how to like code just to like create district maps. So like people began to use it, like the NAACP and like groups that didn't have a lot of funding turned to the Caliper Corporation in order to like have access to like maps and a cheap resource where they could like influence redistricting in the process, right? But then Caliper Corp made it even more accessible and created this thing called Maptitude because they wanted to be a little bit more hip because GIS isn't that hip. And so like this technology was super easy to use. So they were able to like partner with like, not partner with, but like work with like Redmap and like have their technology utilized all over. And so like it's pretty much a really big success story, but at the same time, you have to think about what was succeeding because it was redistricting and making sure that like some groups aren't equally represented. So now that we have all of that like incredibly sad information, how are people trying to solve gerrymandering? There's like a few different ideas, right? So one is nonpartisan commissions. And so this is being adopted in a few different states. Like, for example, I'm pretty sure Nevada does it. And so each state chooses its commission differently, but what all of the states try to do is make sure that elected officials don't have a lot of influence on like the process because they're the ones who are going to be running in these elections. So we don't want them to be, or like these commissions don't want the elected officials to have a lot of influence on where they'll be running. Another way is to use algorithms. So pretty much what like the Caliper Corporation and Maptitude does is it uses algorithms and like maps to like make sure that these like lines are drawn in whatever way that the user chooses. So technically, we could also use algorithms to end gerrymandering and make it more fair for more people, right? And the last way is through proportional weight, like voting. So this would pretty much like change the entire like political system. So it's probably not going to happen, but it has been thrown around. Like proportional voting is pretty much the idea that you wouldn't be voting directly for one person or another. You would just cast your vote for a specific political party. And so like that party would decide who the representative ends up being. But there's a lot of like criticism around this because like you wouldn't get to choose who your representative is. You would only get to choose like the general political party, and that would put a lot less power in the voters' hands. So it's probably not going to happen, but it is like what was used in a lot of places before like the change to districts was implemented after the Civil War. So what should everyone take away? Oh yeah, Katarina, I don't know how the electoral system works in England, but I'm sure that it might be like proportional voting. So what should we take away from this? The first is that Supreme Court rulings have like limited the federal court's ability to stop gerrymandering. And so, like, obviously, we can't end gerrymandering completely, right? Because there's always going to be competing interests, like whether or not to keep a group together or to maintain, like, compactness for a specific geographic area. But they've limited the federal court's ability to, like, decide whether or not districts are unfair. Another thing to take away is that gerrymandering allows political parties to choose their voters, not for voters to choose their political representatives. And so that's one of the reasons why a lot of people are critical about gerrymandering, because it, like the state legislature, the people that you elect could be the exact same people that turn around and decide that they don't want you voting for them because it might take them out of power. And so that's one of the reasons why gerrymandering and a lot of people think it's very unfair. The last thing I want to say is there's this game called, this website called redistrictinggame.org. And so we use this in my AP government class last year to like understand how gerrymandering could be used for like political gain and different political objectives. And so it's a really interesting way to like figure out how to like change districts and like balance all of the different interests that people are giving you. And so like honestly, even on easy mode, it can be a little bit difficult. So I would say like if you want to figure out more about gerrymandering and like get a little bit hands-on, I would definitely check out the website. So yeah, that's all I got. If anyone has any questions, I'll wait a couple minutes and then we can all tune out after that. Have I spoken to my local representatives about gerrymandering? No, not yet, I would say. My representative is currently in Washington, definitely planning on heading down to his office at some point when he's back. Yeah, but I wouldn't say I've done it right now. That was actually a really good question, Brandon. Brandon says we should go together, and he's right, because we definitely could, because we live in the exact same area. So Katarina asks, so when white flight happens, do they redraw the lines? How often should they redraw the lines? Okay, so right now they redraw the lines after every single census, so every 10 years. So white flight is pretty much when a bunch of like white people leave an area because it's like dominated by like POC, people of color. So yeah, sometimes they do redraw the lines. They don't do it immediately, obviously, because you have to wait until the census happens. But it also like depends on which political party is in power at the time and whether or not that is going to be advantageous to them. So there's like a lot of things that go into whether or not that district will be redrawn, because if there's a huge demographic change, then it very likely will be, but it also depends on which political party is redrawing the lines. So yeah. So Brandon asks if there are any other recent redistricting efforts like what happened in Pennsylvania in 2016 and 2018. So first, I'll provide a little bit of background. In Pennsylvania in 2018, because their like state lines were so, like district lines were so gerrymandered, they had to redraw a map right before the 2018 election. And so off the top of my head, I can't think of any recent redistricting efforts like that in Pennsylvania, but I do know that I think it was Wisconsin recently approved a ballot initiative in 2018 to have an independent commission to redistrict. So that was like one of their efforts to like stop extreme partisan gerrymandering. Yeah. Oh, and so what these nonpartisan commissions like do, one thing I didn't add earlier, is that a lot of times they take like input from the public before they do the redistricting. So like you can come and like talk about your community and how it looks different from other communities in order to like make sure that you're actually like represented in your district. So that's super cool. Okay, if that's all, I'll just end this stream here. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Bye-bye.